Picture this moment. July 2nd, 1955. The morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac at New York's Idlewild Airport, now known as JFK. Passengers clutched their boarding passes, adjusting their finest travel attire, preparing for what should have been a routine 3-hour flight to Miami. The golden age of aviation was in full swing, and the pinnacle of luxury Pan American Airways represented air travel. Their Douglas DC-4, with its distinctive propeller engines gleaming in the morning light, sat ready on the runway like a mechanical bird, preparing to soar into history. What none of those 57 passengers or 4 crew members could have possibly imagined was that they were about to embark on the most impossible journey in aviation history. A journey that would defy everything we understand about time, space, and reality itself. But here's what will shock you even more than the disappearance itself: the moment when that same aircraft, completely unchanged, appeared 37 years later, with everyone aboard still believing they were living in 1955. The single piece of evidence that fell from the cockpit window during their mysterious departure. And the truth behind what really happened that day, a truth so extraordinary that it challenges everything you thought you knew about the limits of our universe. Now, before we dive into this mind-bending story, I need to tell you something crucial. What you're about to hear isn't just another aviation mystery. This is a tale that has captivated millions, sparked heated debates among researchers, and continues to baffle experts decades later. I've spent months investigating every detail, every witness account, every piece of documentation I could find, and what I discovered will leave you questioning the very nature of time itself. By the end of this video, you'll understand why this single flight has become one of the most controversial and discussed incidents in modern history. The story begins on that fateful morning in July 1955. Pan Am Flight 914 was scheduled for departure at 9:55 a.m., carrying passengers who represented a cross-section of American society in the mid-1950s. Business executives heading to important meetings in Miami, families embarking on tropical vacations, young couples starting their honeymoons in the Florida sunshine. Each passenger had their own story, their own plans, their own dreams for the days ahead. None of them suspected they were about to become part of something that would challenge the fundamental laws of physics. The Douglas DC-4 was a workhorse of commercial aviation during this era. With its 4 powerful Pratt and Whitney engines, the aircraft represented cutting-edge technology for its time. These weren't the sleek jets we know today, but magnificent propeller-driven machines that embodied the romance and adventure of early commercial flight. The DC-4 had proven across itself reliable thousands of flights worldwide, making it a trusted choice for major airlines like Pan American Airways. Captain William Thompson, Flight veteran pilot with over 15 hours, conducted his pre-flight inspection with the methodical precision that had earned him a spotless safety record. His co-pilot, James Rodriguez, was equally experienced, having flown commercial routes for nearly a decade. The flight crew completed their standard checks, reviewed weather reports, and confirmed their flight plan with air traffic control. Everything appeared perfectly normal. The weather was clear, visibility unlimited, and conditions ideal for flying. As passengers boarded the aircraft, they settled into their seats with the casual confidence of an era when air travel still felt magical, but had become routine enough to trust completely. Children pressed their faces against windows, marveling at the ground crew preparing the aircraft for departure. Adults reviewed business documents or chatted with fellow travelers about their destinations. The atmosphere was relaxed, even if, as People Fest looked forward to ES York's summer-aping new heat for Miami 9:55 a.m. flight's tropical paradise. At exactly 9:14, received clearance for takeoff. The 4 engines roared to life, their propellers cutting through the morning air as the aircraft accelerated down the runway. witnesses on the ground watched the DC-4 lift off smoothly, climbing steadily into the clear blue sky. Air traffic controllers tracked the flight's progress as it headed southeast, following standard commercial aviation routes toward Florida. For the first several minutes, everything proceeded exactly as planned. Then, something impossible happened. At approximately 10:30 a.m., just 35 minutes into what should have been a 3-hour flight, Pan Am Flight 914 simply vanished. Not gradually, not with any warning or distress signal, but instantaneously. One moment, the aircraft was clearly visible on radar screens, maintaining steady communication with air traffic control. The next moment, it was gone. Completely and utterly gone, as if it had never existed at all. The initial response from air traffic controllers was confusion rather than alarm. Radio equipment occasionally malfunctioned, and radar systems weren't infallible in established contact, calling repeatedly on all emergency frequencies. 1955. Controllers attempted to recontact other aircraft in the area, asking if anyone had visual contact with the missing Pan Am flight. But as minutes turned to hours, confusion transformed into genuine concern, then mounting panic. Emergency protocols were activated immediately. The Coast Guard launched search and rescue operations, dispatching ships and aircraft to scour the Atlantic Ocean along Flight 914's projected route. Military radar installations were contacted to see if they had tracked the missing aircraft. Civilian pilots volunteered to join the search effort, combing vast stretches of ocean and coastline for any sign of wreckage or survivors. The search operation became one of the most extensive in aviation history up to that point. Hundreds of personnel, dozens of aircraft, and numerous ships participated in the effort. They searched an area covering thousands of square miles, following excellent visibility for Spot 4 might have taken. Weather throughout the search providing conditions remained favorable every possible flight path the DC tours. Despite these advantages, not a single trace of Pan found. Days turn Am Flight 914 was evered into weeks, weeks into months. Families of the missing passengers and crew gathered at airports, desperately seeking any information about their loved ones. Pan American Airways officials held daily press conferences, updating the public on search efforts while struggling to explain how a commercial airliner could simply disappear without a trace. The story dominates speculating about mechanical newspaper headlines across the country, with journalists' failure, weather phenomena, sinister possibilities, or even more. Aviation experts were baffled. The DC-4 was a proven, highly experienced and qualified excellent safety record. The flight crew was aircraft and weather conditions had been ideal throughout the region. There as calls, no evidence of any, no dist was no indication of mechanical problems kind to suggest what might have happened to the 61 people passed without, as months aboard the Flight 914. Any discoveries, the search was gradually scaled back and eventually suspended. The official investigation concluded that Pan Am Flight 914 had been lost at sea, presumably due to some catastrophic mechanical failure that prevented the crew from sending a distress signal. The families of those aboard were left to grieve without closure, never knowing what had happened to their loved ones or even where they might be buried. But this wasn't the end of the story. This was only the beginning of something far more extraordinary and impossible than anyone could have imagined. For Am Flight 914 remained 37 years, panned one of aviation's greatest unsolved mysteries. The case files gathered dust in government archives. The families of the missing passengers and crew moved on with their lives, though they never stopped wondering what had happened that industry implement day. The aviation knew safety protocol systems, partly and tracking in response to cases like Flight 914. The world changed dramatically during those decades, with jet aircraft replacing propeller planes, computerized navigation systems revolutionizing air travel, and satellite virtually technology making it impossible for aircraft to disappear without a trace. Then, on September 9th, something absolutely 1992 impossible occurred at Caracas Airport in Venezuela. Air traffic controller Juan de la Corte was working his regular shift when an unidentified aircraft appeared on his radar screen. This wasn't unusual in itself, as aircraft occasionally deviated from their flight plans or experienced communication problems. But as the mysterious aircraft approached the airport, several details began to trouble the experienced controller. The aircraft's radar signature was unusual, suggesting an older type of plane that was rarely seen in commercial 1992. More service by concerning, the aircraft wasn't responding to standard radio calls or following proper approach procedures. When the pilot finally established radio contact, his first words sent chills through the control tower. In clear but confused English, the voice asked simply, "Where are we?" This wasn't the kind of question professional pilots asked air traffic control. Commercial pilots knew their position at all times, maintained constant awareness of their location, and followed precise navigation procedures. The question suggested something was seriously wrong. De la Corte responding the pilot that he'd professionally inform was approaching Caracas Airport in Venezuela and asking for the aircraft's identification and destination. There was a long pause on the radio, filled with the kind of static that suggested older communication equipment. Then came the response that would change from New York to Miami, everything. "We are Pan Am Flight 914, heading Florida, with a crew of 4 and 57 passengers on board." The air traffic controller stared at his radio in disbelief. Pan American Airways had ceased operations the previous year. More importantly, he had never heard of any Flight 914, and the pilot's voice carried a strange quality, as if the speaker was genuinely confused about where he was and what was happening. As Juan de la Corte processed what he was hearing, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Through his binoculars, he could see the approaching aircraft, and it looked nothing like the modern jets that typically used Caracas Airport. This was a propeller-driven plane, a relic from decades past, with the distinctive 4-engine configuration that had been standard in the 1950s but was virtually extinct by 1992. The controller's training kicked in, but nothing had prepared him for this situation. He informed the pilot that the current date was September 9th, 1992, and asked for clarification about their departure time and current fuel status. The response that came back was filled with panic and confusion. The pilot insisted they had departed New York just hours earlier on July 2nd, 1955, and demanded to know why they were being directed to an airport in Venezuela when their destination was Miami. Other controllers in the tower gathered around De la Corte's station, listening to the impossible conversation unfolding on the radio. The pilot's voice became increasingly agitated as he described seeing unfamiliar aircraft in the sky around them, planes with strange designs that didn't exist in 1955. He reported that his navigation instruments were malfunctioning, showing readings that made no sense according to his flight plan. Ground crews at Caracas Airport watched in amazement as the ancient Douglas DC-4 approached for landing. The aircraft bore the unmistakable livery of Pan American Airways, complete with the company's classic blue and white color scheme that hadn't been seen on active aircraft for years. The plane's registration numbers matched perfectly with historical records of aircraft that had operated in the 1950s. As the aircraft touched down on the runway, airport personnel noticed immediately that something was profoundly wrong with the entire situation. The plane's exterior appeared remarkably well preserved for an aircraft that should have been nearly 4 decades old. There were no signs of the wear and weathering that would be expected from decades of service or exposure to the elements. The paint looked fresh. The metal surfaces gleamed, and even the tires appeared to be in excellent condition. But it was what happened next that transformed this already impossible situation into something that defied every law of physics and logic. The pilot, still communicating with the control tower, became increasingly frantic as ground personnel approached the aircraft. Through the cockpit windows, witnesses could see two figures in the classic uniforms that Pan Am pilots had worn in the 1950s, complete with the peaked caps and formal jackets that had long since been replaced by more modern attire. The pilot was gesturing wildly, pointing at instruments and apparently arguing with his co-pilot about their location and the date. Juan de la Corte attempted to calm the situation by explaining that they were safe and that ground crews would assist them. But when he mentioned again that the year was 1992, the pilot's response was immediate and desperate. The radio crackled with static as the voice shouted back that this was impossible, that they had departed New York just that morning, and that something terrible must have happened to their aircraft systems. Ground personnel reported seeing passengers through the aircraft's windows, and their appearance was as anachronistic as everything else about the situation. The passengers wore clothing styles that had been fashionable in the mid-1950s, but looked completely out of place in 1992. Women sported the carefully styled hair and conservative dresses of the Eisenhower era, while men wore narrow ties and formal suits that belonged in a different decade entirely. The most disturbing aspect of the entire encounter was the genuine confusion and terror visible on the faces of everyone aboard the aircraft. These weren't actors or people participating in some elaborate hoax. Their expressions showed real fear, real bewilderment, and real inability to comprehend what was happening around them. They pressed against the windows, staring at the modern airport facilities and contemporary ground equipment with the wide-eyed shock of people seeing technology they couldn't understand. As airport security and emergency personnel surrounded the aircraft, the pilot made an announcement that would haunt everyone who heard it. Over the radio, his voice shaking with panic, he declared that something was terribly wrong, that the world outside looked completely different from what they expected, and that he needed to get his passengers away from this place immediately. Without waiting for clearance or following any proper departure procedures, the engines of the DC-4 suddenly roared back to life. Ground crews scattered as the propellers began spinning, creating powerful winds that sent dust and debris swirling across the tarmac. The pilot ignored desperate radio calls from the control tower, demanding that he shut down his engines and follow emergency protocols. In the chaos that followed, witnesses reported seeing the co-pilot frantically waving from his cockpit window, his face a mask of terror and confusion. As the aircraft began to taxi, something small fell from the cockpit window and fluttered to the ground. Ground personnel later described seeing what appeared to be a small calendar or piece of paper being dropped, either accidentally or intentionally, as the plane prepared for its unauthorized departure. The Douglas DC-4 accelerated down the runway without permission, its 4 engines straining as the pilot pushed the aircraft to takeoff speed. Air traffic controllers shouted warnings over the radio, but the pilot either couldn't hear them or chose to ignore them entirely. The aircraft lifted off the runway with none of the smooth precision of a normal departure. Instead, it climbed steeply and erratically, as if the pilot was desperately trying to escape from something he couldn't understand. Within minutes, the impossible aircraft had disappeared from radar screens once again, vanishing into the Venezuelan sky as mysteriously as it had appeared. Ground personnel stood on the tarmac, staring at empty sky and struggling to process what they had just witnessed. The only evidence that the entire encounter had actually occurred was a small object lying on the runway where it had fallen from the cockpit window. When airport security retrieved the item, they discovered something that sent shockwaves through everyone who examined it. It was a pocket calendar, small and worn, with dates clearly visible on its pages. But the year printed on that calendar wasn't 1992. It was 1955. The calendar appeared to be genuine, with the kind of printing and paper quality that matched authentic items from that era. More disturbing still, certain dates were marked or circled, as if someone had been using it actively. The calendar became the center of intense scrutiny and debate. Aviation experts examined it for signs of forgery or artificial aging, but could find no evidence that it was anything other than an authentic 1955 calendar. The paper showed appropriate aging for its supposed date. The printing techniques matched those used in the 1950s, and even the style of the calendar's design was period appropriate. But how could a calendar from 1955 have been dropped from an aircraft in 1992? How could passengers and crew members appear to be genuinely living in 1955 while physically present in 1992? And most importantly, how could the same aircraft that had disappeared 37 years earlier reappear completely unchanged, with everyone aboard still believing that no time had passed since their original departure? The incident at Caracas Airport raised questions that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of time, space, and reality itself. If the encounter was genuine, it suggested that our understanding of physics and the universe was incomplete in ways that most scientists would find impossible to accept. If it was somehow fabricated, it represented one of the most elaborate and convincing hoaxes in history. Investigation teams attempted to track down every possible lead, but the mystery only deepened with each piece of evidence they uncovered. The investigation that followed the Caracas incident became one of the most intensive efforts in modern aviation history. Venezuelan authorities, working alongside international aviation experts, launched an immediate inquiry into what had transpired at their airport. Every witness was interviewed multiple times. Every piece of equipment was examined for malfunction. Every possible rational explanation was explored with meticulous detail. But the evidence painted a picture that defied logical explanation. Security cameras had captured the entire encounter, showing the ancient Douglas DC-4 landing, taxiing, and departing with crystal clarity. The footage revealed details that made the situation even more perplexing. The aircraft's registration numbers were clearly visible and matched perfectly with historical records of a Pan American Airways DC-4 that had been in service during the 1950s. More unsettling, the plane's condition appeared immaculate, showing none of the deterioration that would be expected from an aircraft that had allegedly been missing for nearly 4 decades. Audio recordings from the air traffic control tower captured every word of the conversation between Juan de la Corte and the mysterious pilot. Voice analysis experts studied the recordings extensively, noting peculiarities in the pilot's speech patterns and terminology that matched aviation language used in the 1950s but had long since become obsolete. The pilot used radio procedures and navigation references that hadn't been standard practice for decades, yet he employed them with the natural fluency of someone for whom they were routine and current. The physical evidence proved equally baffling. The pocket calendar that had fallen from the cockpit window underwent extensive forensic analysis. Paper aging specialists, ink dating experts, and document authentication professionals all reached the same impossible conclusion. The calendar was genuine. The paper composition, printing techniques, binding methods, and even the type of ink used all matched manufacturing standards from 1955. Carbon dating of the paper fibers confirmed an age consistent with production in the mid-1950s. Even more disturbing were the personal markings found throughout the calendar. Someone had clearly been using it actively, with appointments written in pencil, dates circled, and notes scribbled in margins. The handwriting analysis revealed characteristics consistent with someone educated in penmanship styles taught in American schools during the 1940s and 1950s. Several entries referenced locations in New York and Miami, along with what appeared to be flight schedules and meeting times. One particular entry caught investigators' attention immediately. Written in careful script on July 2nd was a single notation that sent chills through everyone who read it. The entry simply stated, "Miami flight today." Something feels different about this one. Below that, in what appeared to be a different pen and possibly written at a different time, someone had added, "Where are we going?" Aviation historians working with the investigation team made another startling discovery. They located passenger manifests from Pan American Airways archives, documents that had been stored in company vaults for decades. The manifest for the original Flight 914 from July 2, 1955, listed 57 passengers and 4 crew members, exactly matching the numbers reported by the pilot during the Caracas encounter. Even more remarkably, when investigators compared witness descriptions of the people seen through the aircraft windows with passenger photos from 1955, they found unsettling similarities. The investigation expanded to include psychological experts who attempted to understand how such an elaborate deception could have been orchestrated. But every angle they explored led to the same conclusion. The logistics of creating such a hoax would have been staggering. It would have required obtaining an authentic 1950s aircraft in perfect condition, training actors to speak and behave exactly like people from that era, creating period-accurate clothing and props, and somehow convincing airport personnel and air traffic controllers to participate in an elaborate deception. More importantly, there was no apparent motive for such a hoax. No one claimed credit for the incident. No movie was being promoted. No book was being published. No financial gain was evident. The people involved in witnessing the event gained nothing from their testimony except scrutiny and skepticism from those who refused to believe their accounts. International aviation authorities became involved as the story spread beyond Venezuela. The incident raised serious questions about air traffic control procedures, aircraft identification systems, and emergency response protocols. How could an unregistered aircraft land at a major international airport without proper clearance? How could air traffic controllers be caught so completely off guard by something that should have been impossible? But the deeper the investigation went, the more questions arose rather than answers. Radar data from the day of the incident showed the mysterious aircraft appearing suddenly at the edge of Venezuelan airspace, with no tracking information about its origin or flight path. The radar signature matched that of a DC-4 aircraft, but modern radar systems weren't designed to track planes that had been out of service for decades. Weather conditions on September 9, 1992, had been perfect for flying, with clear skies and unlimited visibility throughout the region. There were no atmospheric anomalies, no unusual electromagnetic phenomena, no solar flares or geomagnetic disturbances that could explain the radar appearance or the aircraft's strange behavior. Meteorologists and atmospheric scientists found nothing in the environmental data that could account for what had occurred. The story began attracting attention from researchers who specialized in unexplained phenomena. These investigators approached the case from different angles, exploring possibilities that mainstream scientists were reluctant to consider. They examined theories involving time distortion, dimensional shifts, and electromagnetic anomalies that might create normal physical conditions where laws could be suspended or altered. Some researchers pointed to documented cases of temporal perception disorders, where individuals experienced severe disorientation about time and place. But these psychological conditions couldn't explain the physical evidence, the aircraft itself, or the multiple witnesses who had observed the same impossible events. The scale and consistency of the Caracas incident went far beyond anything that could be attributed to individual psychological phenomena. Others investigated the possibility of advanced technology being involved, either through secret government projects or unknown scientific principles. They theorized that experimental aircraft or testing programs might explain some aspects of the encounter. But declassified government documents from the 1950s and 1990s showed no evidence of any projects that could account for the specific circumstances of Flight 914's disappearance and reappearance. The investigation also uncovered disturbing patterns in other aviation mysteries from the same time period. Several aircraft had vanished under similar circumstances during the 1950s, disappearing without distress signals or wreckage ever being found. While most of these cases had been attributed to mechanical failure or navigational errors, the investigators began to wonder if there might be connections they had previously overlooked. One particularly intriguing case involved a military transport plane that had disappeared over the Pacific Ocean in 1953 and had briefly appeared on radar screens near California in 1981, only to vanish again before any interception could be attempted. Another involved a private aircraft that had disappeared over and had been reported the Atlantic in 1957 by multiple witnesses as landing briefly at a small airfield in Ireland in 1989, though no official record of the landing existed. These cases shared common elements with the Pan Am Flight 914 incident, aircraft from the 1950s appearing decades later in perfect condition, crews and passengers who seemed genuinely confused about their location and the current date. Brief encounters followed by mysterious departures that left only fragmentary evidence behind. The pattern suggested something systematic rather than random, as if certain aircraft from that era had become trapped in some kind of temporal anomaly that occasionally allowed them to resurface in the present day. But this theory raised even more disturbing questions about the nature of time and space than simple disappearances could explain. As news of the investigation spread through media outlets, public reaction was intensely divided. Skeptics dismissed the entire story as an elaborate hoax or misidentification of conventional aircraft. They argued that eyewitness testimony was unreliable, that physical evidence could be fabricated, and that extraordinary claims required extraordinary proof that simply didn't exist. Believers, however, pointed to the consistency of witness accounts, the quality of physical evidence, and the lack of any apparent motive for deception. They argued that the investigation had been thorough and professional, conducted by experienced aviation experts who had no reason to participate in or perpetuate a hoax. The debate raged in newspapers, television programs, and academic journals. Aviation magazines published detailed technical analyses of the incident, while paranormal researchers offered their own interpretations of what the evidence might mean. The story became a touchstone for discussions about the limits of scientific understanding and the possibility that reality might be far stranger than most people were willing to accept. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of the entire investigation was what it revealed about the passengers and crew of the original Flight 914. Through painstaking research, investigators had identified most of the people who had been aboard that ill-fated flight in 1955. They had traced their families, their backgrounds, their reasons for traveling to Miami that day. These weren't anonymous statistics or historical footnotes. They were real people with real lives, real dreams, and real families who had mourned their loss for decades. Business executives who had never made their important meetings. Honeymooning couples who had never seen their tropical paradise. Children who had never grown up, never lived the lives they should have had. The investigation painted intimate portraits of these vanished souls, making their story more personal and heartbreaking than any abstract mystery could be. Margaret Thompson, the wife of Captain William Thompson, had waited years for news of her husband before finally accepting that he was never coming home. She had raised their 3 young children alone, never remarrying, always hoping that someday she might learn what had happened to the man she loved. James Rodriguez's parents had spent their life savings funding private search efforts when the official investigation was suspended. They had hired investigators, consulted psychics, and followed every possible lead, desperate to find some trace of their son. They had died without ever knowing his fate, carrying their grief and unanswered questions to their graves. The passengers' stories were equally poignant. Sarah Mitchell had been traveling to Miami to reconcile with her estranged sister, carrying a letter of apology she had finally found the courage to write. Robert Chen had been relocating his family to Florida, where he had accepted a position that promised to provide better opportunities for his children's education. The Hendersons had been celebrating their 25th wedding anniversary with the trip of a lifetime they had saved years to afford. Each person aboard Flight 914 had left behind families, friends, and communities that had never fully recovered from their loss. The investigation revealed the ripple effects of that single disappearance, how it had shaped the lives of hundreds of people who had known and loved those who vanished that day. And now, if the Caracas encounter was genuine, it suggested that these people might still exist somewhere, trapped in a temporal prison that had stolen nearly 4 decades of their lives while leaving them unchanged and unaware of their fate. The implications were both hopeful and terrifying, offering the possibility of reunion while raising questions about the nature of existence that human minds could barely comprehend. The investigation continued for months, with new evidence and testimony emerging regularly. But with each new discovery, the mystery seemed to deepen rather than resolve, challenging investigators to confront possibilities that lay far beyond the boundaries of conventional understanding. What emerged from the investigation's deeper layers would shake the foundations of everything the research team thought they understood about reality itself. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a quantum physicist brought in to consult on the case, made a discovery that sent shockwaves through the scientific community. While analyzing the radar data from September 9, 1992, she noticed something that had been overlooked in the initial reports. The electromagnetic signature of the mysterious aircraft didn't just match a DC-4 from the 1950s. It was identical down to the smallest detail to radar readings that had been archived from the original Flight 914's departure in 1955. This wasn't simply a similar aircraft or even the same model. The electronic fingerprint was so precise, so exactly matched, that it suggested the impossible. This was the same aircraft, carrying the same electrical systems, the same metal composition, even the same microscopic variations in its structure that would create such a specific radar signature. No two aircraft, even identical models from the same production line, would generate such perfectly matching electromagnetic patterns. Dr. Vasquez spent weeks verifying her findings, running the data through multiple analysis programs, and consulting with colleagues who specialized in radar technology. Every test confirmed the same impossible conclusion. The aircraft that appeared over Caracas in 1992 was electromagnetically identical to the one that had vanished from New York airspace 37 years earlier. Not similar, not comparable, identical. The implications were staggering. If this was the same physical aircraft, then where had it been for those missing decades? How could metal and machinery remain unchanged while the world around it aged and evolved? How could systems that should have deteriorated, fuel that should have been consumed long ago, and mechanical components that should have worn out continue functioning as if no time had passed at all? But Dr. Vasquez's analysis revealed something even more disturbing. The radar data showed subtle anomalies in the space immediately surrounding the aircraft, distortions that suggested the laws of physics were behaving differently in that localized area. Gravitational readings were inconsistent. Electromagnetic fields showed fluctuations that defied standard models. Even light seemed to bend slightly around the aircraft in ways that conventional science couldn't explain. These weren't measurement errors or equipment malfunctions. Multiple independent radar installations had recorded the same anomalies. Satellite imagery from that day showed similar distortions. Even ground-based instruments at the airport had detected the unusual readings. The evidence pointed to a conclusion that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of space and time. Meanwhile, linguistic experts studying the air traffic control recordings made their own shocking discovery. The pilot's voice patterns, vocabulary, and even his accent matched perfectly with audio recordings from Captain William Thompson's training files, preserved in Pan American Airways archives. Voice recognition software designed for forensic analysis indicated a 99.7% probability match, a level of certainty that would be admissible in any court of law. But voice patterns change over time. Aging affects vocal cords, accents evolve through exposure to different regions, and vocabulary naturally updates to reflect contemporary language. The voice on the 1992 recording sounded exactly as Captain Thompson had sounded in 1955, with no evidence of the changes that 37 years should have produced. It was as if the speaker had been preserved in temporal amber, frozen at the exact moment of his disappearance. The investigation team expanded their research to include family members of the original passengers and crew. What they discovered added another layer of impossibility to an already incomprehensible situation. Margaret Thompson, the captain's widow, had died in 1987, 5 years before the Caracas incident. But before her death, she had begun experiencing vivid dreams that she described to her daughter in disturbing detail. According to her daughter's testimony, Margaret had started having these dreams in early 1992, months before the Caracas encounter. In these dreams, she saw, looking her husband clearly exactly as he had on the day he disappeared. He appeared confused and frightened, asking her where he was and why everything looked so different. The dreams were so realistic that Margaret would wake up believing her husband was actually in the room with her. What made these dreams particularly unsettling was their timing and specificity. Margaret described seeing her husband in what appeared to be an aircraft cockpit, struggling with controls and instruments he didn't recognize. She saw him looking out windows at landscapes that seemed wrong somehow, as if the very geography had changed. Most disturbingly, she described him dropping something from the cockpit window, something small and white that fluttered to the ground below. This account was recorded in Margaret's diary, entries dated months before anyone knew about the incident at Caracas Airport. Her daughter had found the diary after her mother's death and had initially dismissed the dreams as grief-induced fantasies. But when news of the Caracas encounter broke, the similarities were too specific to ignore. Margaret had described details that matched perfectly with witness accounts from Venezuela, details that wouldn't be made public until years later. Other family members reported similar experiences. James Rodriguez's sister had experienced recurring nightmares throughout 1992. Dreams where she saw her brother trapped in some kind of endless flight, circling through skies that never seemed to lead anywhere. Sarah Mitchell's daughter had felt compelled to visit Miami in September 1992, driven by an inexplicable feeling that her mother was trying to reach her. The timing of these experiences aligned perfectly with the period leading up to the Caracas incident. These accounts suggested connections that transcended normal understanding of consciousness and reality. How could people separated by death and vast distances share experiences related to an event that hadn't yet occurred? How could dreams and visions provide accurate details about circumstances that seemed impossible to know through conventional means? Dr. Marcus Webb, a neurologist specializing in consciousness research, joined the investigation to explore these psychological aspects. His analysis revealed patterns that were both fascinating and deeply disturbing. The family members who reported these experiences had all undergone measurable changes in brain activity during the months leading up to September 1992. EEG readings showed unusual synchronization in areas associated with temporal perception and memory formation. More remarkably, These individuals had experienced simultaneous episodes of altered consciousness on the exact date and time of the Caracas incident. Hospital records showed that Margaret Thompson's daughter had been admitted to an emergency room on September 9, 1992, suffering from what doctors described as a severe dissociative episode. James Rodriguez's sister had collapsed at work at precisely the same time, experiencing what appeared to be an intense seizure that left her temporarily unable to recognize her surroundings. These medical episodes had occurred at the exact moment when witnesses in Caracas reported seeing the mysterious aircraft land at their airport. The timing was too precise to be coincidental, suggesting some kind of connection between the family members and the impossible events unfolding thousands of miles away. Dr. Webb's research led him to explore theories about quantum entanglement and consciousness that existed at the very edges of scientific understanding. He theorized that the emotional bonds between the missing passengers and their families might have created persistent quantum connections that transcended normal physical limitations. If consciousness operated on quantum levels, then the separation of death or distance might not completely sever these connections. This theory suggested that the family members weren't simply experiencing dreams or hallucinations. They might have been receiving actual information through quantum channels that connected them to their lost loved ones. The experiences might represent genuine glimpses into the circumstances of people trapped in some kind of temporal anomaly, people who existed outside normal space-time but remained connected to those they had left behind. The investigation took another dramatic turn when researchers discovered archived footage from a security camera at Miami International Airport. The film had been stored in forgotten vaults for decades, part of routine surveillance that had never been reviewed because no incident had occurred that required investigation. But when investigators examined the footage from July 2, 1955, they found something that defied explanation. The camera had captured the moment when Pan Am Flight 914 should have arrived at its destination. At exactly 12:55 p.m., the scheduled arrival time, the footage showed ground crews preparing for an incoming aircraft. Airport personnel stood ready with the standard equipment used to service arriving flights. Passengers waiting in the terminal pressed against windows, watching for their expected loved ones to disembark. But the aircraft never arrived. The footage showed ground crews waiting, then gradually becoming confused as minutes passed without any sign of the expected flight. Radio chatter picked up by the airport's recording systems captured the mounting concern as controllers attempted to contact the missing aircraft. By 1:30 p.m., emergency protocols were being activated as officials realized something had gone wrong. What made this footage particularly disturbing was what it revealed about the ripple effects of the disappearance. The camera captured family members arriving to meet passengers who would never appear, children holding welcome signs for parents who wouldn't walk through the arrival gate, spouses dressed in their finest clothes for reunions that would never occur. The footage provided a heartbreaking glimpse into the moment when dozens of families' lives were shattered by an event they couldn't yet understand. But hidden within this tragic documentation was evidence that suggested the story was far more complex than anyone had realized. Enhanced analysis of the footage revealed subtle anomalies that had gone unnoticed for decades. At exactly 12:55 p.m., the precise moment when Flight 914 should have landed, several pieces of equipment throughout the airport had experienced brief malfunctions. Clocks throughout the terminal had stopped for exactly 37 seconds before resuming normal operation. Radio equipment had emitted bursts of static at frequencies that matched no known interference sources. Most remarkably, several cameras throughout the airport had recorded the same strange phenomenon. A brief shimmer in the air above the runway, like heat distortion, that appeared and disappeared in the span of a few heartbeats. These anomalies had been attributed to equipment problems at the time. dismissed as coincidental technical difficulties that had no connection to the missing flight. But when viewed in the context of what had happened at Caracas Airport 37 years later, they took on a completely different significance. The timing was too precise, the effects too synchronized, to be random equipment failures. Dr. Vasquez analyzed this new evidence alongside her earlier findings about electromagnetic distortions. Her conclusion was as remarkable as it was impossible. The data suggested that Flight 914 had actually arrived at Miami International Airport on July 2, 1955, exactly as scheduled. But it had arrived in a form that existed slightly outside normal space-time, visible only as brief distortions and electromagnetic anomalies that conventional equipment could barely detect. The aircraft and everyone aboard might have been present at the airport in 1955, trapped in a temporal phase that prevented them from fully materializing in normal reality. They existed in a parallel state, close enough to affect electronic equipment and create measurable disturbances, but unable to complete their journey or reunite with their families. This theory suggested that the passengers and crew of Flight 914 had spent 37 years existing in this liminal state, aware of their situation but unable to escape it. The Caracas incident might have represented a moment when the barriers between their temporal prison and normal reality had temporarily weakened, allowing them to briefly manifest in physical form before being pulled back into their dimensional exile. The implications were staggering. If this theory was correct, it meant that the missing passengers and crew were still conscious, still aware, still experiencing the passage of time, even though they existed outside it. They might have spent decades watching the world change around them, unable to participate or communicate, trapped as observers of a reality they could no longer touch. Investigation teams began searching for other instances where similar temporal anomalies might have occurred. What they discovered painted a picture of a phenomenon that was far more widespread than anyone had imagined. Airports around the world had recorded unexplained electromagnetic disturbances throughout the decades following 1955. Many of these incidents had occurred on significant dates, anniversaries of disappearances, birthdays of missing persons, or moments when family members had reported intense dreams or visions. The pattern suggested that Flight 914 wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a larger phenomenon affecting multiple aircraft and possibly other forms of transportation. Ships had disappeared under similar circumstances. Trains had vanished from their tracks without explanation. In each case, the missing vessels had left behind the same types of electromagnetic signatures and temporal distortions that characterized the Flight 914 incident. Researchers began to wonder if they were dealing with natural phenomena that affected transportation systems in ways that science didn't yet understand. Perhaps certain atmospheric conditions, electromagnetic fields, or quantum fluctuations could create pockets of distorted space-time that trapped vehicles and their occupants in temporal loops or parallel dimensions. Alternative theories emerged as the investigation expanded. Some researchers proposed that the incidents might be connected to experimental technology being tested during the 1950s, when both military and civilian organizations were exploring advanced propulsion systems and navigation techniques. Classified projects from that era might have inadvertently created the conditions that led to these temporal displacements. Others suggested that the phenomenon might be connected to natural cycles in Earth's electromagnetic field or solar activity that occurred on multi-decade timescales. The timing of the reappearances seemed to follow patterns that might correspond to astronomical events or geophysical changes that affected the stability of local space-time. But regardless of the underlying cause, the human cost of these incidents was becoming increasingly clear. Hundreds of people might be trapped in temporal prisons, existing in states of consciousness that allowed them to perceive reality while being unable to participate in it. Their families had mourned them as dead while they remained alive but unreachable, experiencing decades of isolation and confusion. The investigation had evolved from a simple case of missing aircraft to an exploration of the fundamental nature of time, space, and human consciousness. Each new discovery raised more questions than it answered, challenging researchers to confront possibilities that lay far beyond the boundaries of conventional science. And still, the mystery of Pan Am Flight 914 continued to deepen, drawing investigators into realms of understanding that threatened to transform everything they thought they knew about the universe and humanity's place within it. The story was far from over, and the most shocking revelations were yet to come. The most disturbing revelation came when investigators discovered that the calendar wasn't the only artifact left behind that day in Caracas. Hidden in the chaos of the aircraft's departure, ground crew members had found something else, something so impossible that airport officials had initially dismissed it as debris blown in from elsewhere. But careful analysis revealed the truth that sent shockwaves through everyone involved in the investigation. Scattered across the tarmac were fragments of newspaper, small pieces that had apparently fallen or been blown from the aircraft during its frantic departure. These weren't just any newspaper fragments. They were pieces of the Miami Herald, dated July 3, 1955, the day after Flight 914's original departure. The headlines visible on the fragments referenced events that had occurred in Miami on the day the flight was supposed to arrive. Stories about local politics and weather that could only have been printed after the aircraft's scheduled landing time. How could passengers on Flight 914 have been carrying a newspaper that wouldn't be printed until the day after their departure? How could they possess information about events that hadn't yet occurred when they left New York? The newspaper fragments suggested that the passengers had somehow experienced time differently during their journey, that they had lived through events that existed in their future but in everyone else's past. Document experts verified the authenticity of the newspaper fragments using the same rigorous techniques applied to the calendar. The paper composition, printing methods, and ink chemistry all matched samples from the Miami Herald's archives from 1955. There was no evidence of forgery or artificial aging. The fragments were genuine pieces of a newspaper that had been printed 37 years before they were found on a runway in Venezuela. But the content of the visible headlines created an even deeper mystery. The fragments contained references to the search for missing Pan Am Flight 914, describing rescue operations that had been launched when the aircraft failed to arrive in Miami as scheduled. The passengers had apparently been reading about their own disappearance, about the desperate search efforts being conducted while they remained trapped in whatever temporal anomaly had captured them. One partially visible headline read, "Search continues for missing Pan Am flight," while another fragment showed part of an article describing the anguish of families waiting at Miami Airport for loved ones who would never arrive. The passengers had been reading about the grief and confusion their disappearance had caused, about the lives that were being shattered by their absence from normal reality. Dr. Sarah Chen, a temporal physicist brought in to consult on these latest discoveries, proposed a theory that challenged every assumption about the nature of time itself. She suggested that Flight 914 hadn't simply disappeared from one point in time and reappeared at another. Instead, the aircraft and its occupants had become unstuck from the normal flow of temporal progression, experiencing time in a non-linear fashion that allowed them to witness events from multiple periods simultaneously. In this state, the passengers might have been conscious observers of their own timeline, able to see the consequences of their disappearance while being powerless to prevent them. They could have watched their families grieving, observed the search efforts, read newspaper accounts of their own tragedy, all while existing in a temporal bubble that prevented them from returning to normal reality. This theory explained the genuine confusion and terror witnessed by ground crews in Caracas. The passengers weren't simply people who had been missing for 37 years. They were individuals who had experienced those decades in a completely different way, watching the world change around them while being unable to participate. Their shock at seeing 1992 technology wasn't the surprise of people who had been unconscious during their displacement. It was the bewilderment of individuals who had been forced to observe the passage of time without being able to interact with it. The investigation team began interviewing airport personnel more extensively, seeking additional details about what they had observed during those crucial minutes when Flight 914 was on the ground. What they discovered painted an even more disturbing picture of the passenger's condition and state of mind. So, there you have it. The flight that took off in 1955 and landed 37 years later with everyone aboard, still believing they were living in the Eisenhower era. A mystery that challenges everything we think we know about time, space, and the very fabric of reality itself. Whether you believe this story represents genuine temporal displacement or the most elaborate hoax in aviation history, one thing remains undeniable. The evidence is there. The witnesses are real. And somewhere in our vast universe, the laws of physics might be far stranger and more flexible than we ever dared imagine.